Good morning. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association. And today it's my pleasure to re-meet an old acquaintance, Nick Kralev, former Washington Times, former Financial Times, and now founder and head of the Washington Diplomatic Academy. Um, and these are testing times for diplomacy, aren't they? um, so we're here to discuss current and general issues of diplomacy, which is a very sore subject, and we've met many of the same circumstances. But bearing in mind, this morning when we're recording this is the morning that mission has been declared accomplished in the Persian Gulf. And I just was delving in my archives and I couldn't resist. For those of you who don't know, this is an action figure I've just found in my archives of George W. Bush landing on the deck of the aircraft carrier, declaring mission with a banner saying mission accomplished. As diplomacy goes, it wasn't very good because the Iraq war is still not finished in real terms. But it does sound similar, declaring victory regardless of the circumstances. So if we can come to, can you explain your background and how you came to found the Diplomatic Academy? And you also have an op-ed today about Rubio's, let's just say, inadequate diplomatic training program.
Well, thank you, Ian. Yes, good to see you after many years. Well, I came to what I'm doing now precisely as a journalist. Diplomacy was my beat. I was assigned to cover the State Department in Washington for a decade. My first trip with the Secretary of State was back in 2000 when Madeleine Albright was in the job. And so I was still at the Financial Times then. Then I moved to the Washington Times and traveled with Colin, Powell, Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton, and then left daily journalism, or perhaps all journalism, although I suppose still recovering. And during my work as a State Department correspondent, I somehow developed this deep interest in the Foreign Service, in the US Foreign Service, and in professional diplomacy. I was very surprised in terms of how diplomacy is treated. And the question, is it a real profession, was very fascinating to me, because there are different ways to look at it. And
these are men who are sent abroad to lie for their country, is my favorite quote.
Well, obviously there are many definitions of diplomacy. Yes. If you open any dictionary, you will find a different definition.
Well, that's a 400-year-old British one.
Right. But the point is, beyond the headlines and the stories that I was expected to write every day as a correspondent, stories that perhaps would make the front page, right? They focused, of course, on policy and what the Secretary of State was doing, where they were going, what they were saying. But I also had this interest in the daily work of the daily grind of career diplomacy, right? Of the career diplomats who make it happen every day at embassies and consulates and other diplomatic missions around the world. And so when I left, I wrote a book about the US Foreign Service called America's Other Army. And in the process of actually researching and then promoting the book, I was horrified by the lack of formal training in diplomacy. And I understood why many people do not consider it a real profession, because no government was paying any close to enough attention to proper training, right? What I would call tradecraft, right? The skills, the duties, and the responsibilities of the daily work of modern diplomacy. And so when I was promoting the book and visiting all these many, well, more than a dozen countries, I would often speak at their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I would learn that they were even worse than what the Americans do, which is they take you in, in many countries assume that if you have a master's in international relations, you are ready to practice diplomacy. And of course, having a degree, even a master's in international relations, it's not nearly the same as diplomatic practice, right? You need additional training for that. Nobody's born with the skills to practice diplomacy. Let's face it. Some of us are better people. We say people person, right? In other words, much someone who for whom communication perhaps comes more easily, or perhaps they are better equipped to charm people for, for that one reason or another. But most of the other skills have to be acquired. And I did some research to see if there were a place, anywhere in the world, where someone interested in diplomacy as a career could go and get a taste, get a sense of what this work and career and lifestyle is really about. And there wasn't. This was about a decade ago. There wasn't. Yes, some countries had opened their diplomatic institutes or academies, but of course, you already had to be accepted into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to have access to those facilities. And the second problem that I found at the time was, well, they're teaching mostly what you can learn at university. And to me, that was a waste of time, right? And we ask of young people a lot, not just young people, of course. People change careers and come into the Foreign Service in their 40s and 50s. But the fact was that if you thought perhaps diplomacy could be for you, you jumped in it almost blindfolded because you did not have realistic ideas or expectations about what this work and career was about, right? Every day. It's one thing to rely on impressions gained through films and TV shows, which are never realistic. It's another thing to actually know exactly what you're getting yourself into.
Well, it's a bit like riding a bicycle, isn't it?
Right. And in fact,
the only way to learn it is to do it.
When I was researching America's South Army, I visited about 80 US embassies and consulates around the world and interviewed hundreds of people, the 600 Foreign Service officers. And I asked every one of them, did you know what you were getting into when you joined the Foreign Service? And 99% said no. I think that the 1% just didn't want to admit it. But that was the reality. And so I thought there should be this place where you could go and train, whether it would be for a few weeks or for an entire academic year. And now we don't give out academic degrees because we focus on practice. We are supposed, we actually found it with the purpose not to be a university, not to bestow academic degrees. There are many other places who do that. And so we do have certificates, but they're professional training certificates. I was lucky that I am in Washington, where most of our career diplomats retire. And so there were many former career ambassadors like Tom Pickering and Bill Burns, whose names most people know. And so they were very happy to help. In fact, last year, Bill Burns came back after a 4-year absence while he was, of course, the first career diplomat to be director of the CIA, and we were very glad to have him back. And the trainees benefited immensely because who better to learn, right, than from people like Bill Burns? I mean, obviously there are others. We have about 20 instructors who are all career ambassadors.
I mean, you can't teach cunning on a blackboard, can you? Or sensitivity, because this is being. Once upon a time in the past, I was a trade union negotiator. And there are particular skills and habits of knowing what your opposition wants, knowing how much you can give them. It's very similar to diplomacy on the highest level of as you said, tradecraft, knowing just how much and who your opponent is. Will they crack or won't they? You know, what can you do to persuade them? Or maybe they're already on your side and your job is to find an excuse for them. I mean, the Pakistanis this week presumably had to work out how to produce a ladder to get the parties, and especially one party, down from the tree that they climbed up into, which is a diplomatic skill. But I mean, that's also different because that's a sort of intermediary diplomatic skill, as opposed to a diplomat who's representing the country. There's also the diplomat who is sent as an envoy to smooth over an area. Well, Tom Pickering did some of that as well, and then the UN has produced some very good examples over the years. But in the end, it comes down to it's not often cited, but Kofi Annan said when he came back, having got a deal from Saddam Hussein, he said you can do a lot with diplomacy, especially when it's backed with the threat of force,
Yes.
which is the Roosevelt carrying speaking softly and carrying a big stick instead of blustering and carrying a limp reed, which is the more common lately.
Right. Well, the opposite of what Trump is doing. So, of course, negotiation is in fact what most people think of when they hear the word diplomacy, right? But the fact is that most career diplomats spend much more time on a daily basis doing things that are not negotiations, right? To manage a bilateral relationship or a multilateral relationship takes much more than just sit down and negotiate, right? Of course, an embassy has a political section which is supposed to understand what's happening in the country they're in, inform the headquarters so then policymakers can make informed decisions based on actual facts on the ground and not on some fantasies in the parallel universe. You have an economic section that analyzes the economic developments, the economic policies, the commercial policies, the economic data that comes out of whatever country they're in. And they, of course, digest this and again analyze it and send it back to Washington or for whatever the headquarters would be of the country or the capital, to help policymakers, because I don't have to explain to your audience that are your members that the economy of another country affects the economies of many other countries, especially if that country happens to be.
But it's also important that the diplomat concerned knows exactly how far his country can or is prepared to go, because it's pointless bluffing if you don't have the cards.
This is done not only to manage the relationship, the daily relationship between the host country and the home country, but also to take advantage of opportunities and to be an early warning radar of any troubles coming up, right? Because it's much easier for you sitting in this other country than someone sitting in the State Department. And of course, there's public diplomacy, there's consular affairs. It's interesting that, in fact, when I was writing my last book, Diplomatic Tradecraft, which is the first ever practical diplomacy textbook published last year by Cambridge University Press, I decided to put the negotiation chapter at the very end because, especially among the general public, they imagine, well, first of all, let's be real here. Most people anywhere rarely think about diplomacy. When they think of it, they see something on TV. It's a very high level negotiation, whatever it might be, right? And so I always say your average career diplomat has to do so much other work before they get to that level of participating in such high level negotiations. In fact, Tom Pickering helped me with that chapter, and so we co-wrote that chapter together based on his own experience, and there are quite a few examples from his time at the UN because it was at the time of the First Iraq War. So that's of course very interesting. When you were talking about the parallels to today and all that, and with Pakistan, and unfortunately, despite this reputation of being a brilliant negotiator, someone who used to work for him in the last administration this morning on the BBC said that he was the best business negotiator of the century or something like that.
Who was he in this?
Trump. Sorry, of Trump, yes. I have to disagree because I haven't, first of all, I haven't seen any product that would confirm that.
He was a recidivist bankrupt. He was extremely good at was public relations and bullying people into thinking he was a genius.
So here's the thing. Here is my gripe with much of the way that this is presented in the media today. And perhaps some of your members can do something about this. I keep reading and hearing people, not just talking heads on TV, but journalists, talk about Trump's diplomacy and his negotiation style or things like that. And we must be clear. Nothing of what Trump actually does is diplomacy.
This emperor
Okay.
has no clothes.
Right. It's right. So whatever dealings he has, whatever deals he's trying to make, that is not diplomacy. That is not a diplomatic negotiation. Perhaps it's another kind of negotiation, but it's
It was
not.
one of the first articles I wrote in New York when I came
Ah,
was he was on The Apprentice, I think it was, and he was how is somebody who is a recidivist bankrupt, who has driven more companies under than anybody else on the stock market, should be revered as a great business person? It was a triumph of public relations. I had to give him that.
yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, he is a salesman. He marketing is clearly something that is a strong suit for him. But when I look at, I'm not political. I've never said publicly who I vote for. I don't profess or promote any ideology. I look at professionalism, right? The profession of diplomacy, because in fact it is, or it should be a real profession. And when people were writing a few weeks ago, or whenever it was that Greenland was still a hot topic, he met with the NATO Secretary General, who happens to be in Washington today, and even the New York Times published an op-ed by John Kerry. I don't know who wrote the headline of that piece, but it said something about Trump made a deal on Greenland or something, or Trump's deal on Greenland. Trump made no deal on Greenland. I'm sorry. No. All that happened when he was in Europe at the time, it was a Europe trip, he sat down with Mark Rutte, right? And Mark Rutte explained to him uh, quietly, right, and methodically, what the existing agreement between the United States and Denmark concerning Greenland was already allowing the United States to do. And that's pretty much anything. Right? So that's what happened. There was no negotiation, there was no deal reached about Greenland, despite of what Trump might have written on social media. But unfortunately, the stories in media were writing about a deal that Trump made in Greenland, right?
Oh, from me,
And
they were.
so it's that's not. But you're right. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago bullying and all that. So yeah, I wouldn't call it a negotiation. I would call it bullying, coercion, right? This when you look at even the deals that he has made happen, if you think that they are deals, let's say tariffs and things like that, right? They were not the product of diplomatic negotiations, right? Essentially, what happened was, and still is happening. I recently did a trip around the world for another book I'm writing, and his people say, okay, this is what we will do, and then they tell the other side, okay, come back with us to us with whatever you think might help you get a reduced tariff. Right. That's it. If they either do or they don't. Right. Okay. There is some back and forth sometimes, not with every country, but sometimes. In many cases, countries just capitulate. And when I've been asking them as I traveled over the last several weeks, why? Why are you surrendering? And everybody who is surrendering says, well, unfortunately, the United States still has power. And so, that I also happen to think that maybe there's another reason, and that is that perhaps the state of their own diplomacy is not that great, right, of those countries.
Well, it could also be that history does not record the fate of any senator who suggested that Caligula's horse was not the best possible candidate for the Senate or the consulship. You know, there are
Right.
some people that, there are consequences, but then it's your assessment of them. Just
Yes.
diverging
And,
from this, one of the
and-
diplomats I met over the years who I'm horrified at what he's doing now, but was a consummate diplomat when he was at the UN, is Sergei Lavrov from the Russian. I mean, I saw him in the off years when he was a diplomat representing a country that was, and he felt it and said so. It had been humiliated from Yeltsin onwards. The Washington Consensus did more damage to the future of Russia than anything else. They treated it like conquered territory, and it led to it. But this was Sergei Lavrov was very conscious of this, but he was very personable. He used whatever influence he had, and he argued consummately about the issues. He might have lost because of the balance of power in the end, but he was a very effective diplomat. I don't know what happened lately, of course.
Well, I wrote about this briefly in a piece last week, and also remember him in '99, I think, when I first came to the UN to cover it before I went back to the Kennedy School to do my master's. I covered him, not him, but the UN briefly, and I remember him outside the Security Council chamber just chain smoking when you could still smoke, which was
And
disgusting.
drinking scotch as well. I mean, I often shared a scotch with him in the delegates' lounge there.
Yes. So my impression resembles yours. Unfortunately, right before the 2022 invasion, of course, he was one of the Russian officials who were deriding the American intelligence warnings that an invasion would happen imminently, right? And also denying it vehemently until the day it actually happened. So as far as I know, and from my own impressions, when it comes to respect and credibility, he has lost all of it.
Yeah.
I don't think any serious diplomat today will trust or respect Lavrov the way they did in the past.
No,
He comes from, of course, a well-known and respected in the past school of diplomacy, the Russian school of diplomacy, and not literally, right, not a building, but a school in the other sense of the word. And until recently, well, until the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, as we call it, the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, it had become a myth about the Russian school of diplomacy, right? The Russian tradition of diplomacy and how it produced all these brilliant diplomats. I think there was something to it, but I think it was way exaggerated. And because I know about some of how they train, they used to, and they still less of what they still do. Last year I had an event in Singapore, and after the event, this guy came to me and said, "I work for the Russian embassy." And so I know a little about what they do currently. I know more about what they used to do until perhaps 15, 20 years ago. And let's face it, during the Cold War, the Russian diplomats were very good. That became shakier, I suppose, in the 90s and then went downhill from there. But more broadly, when we talk about tradecraft skills, practical skills, right, that have to be acquired, that what drives me nuts is this completely misguided perception that pretty much every American president has shared, and most politicians in any country. And I've been to 112 countries by now, so I've met a lot of them. For some reason, they believe that diplomacy is so easy and common sense and straightforward that anybody can do it. You don't need to have experience to become an ambassador or whatever, right? You just need to have a head on your shoulders that, some sort of intelligence, right?
Or a good career in New York real estate, for example.
Yeah, and it's just that combined with the descriptions of whatever Trump's doing as diplomacy or negotiation, which of course I argue is not. The last week I was thinking about an analogy, real world analogy that will help people understand why this is such a ridiculous misconception about diplomacy, that you can just figure it out as you go, and it's just common sense, and a real estate lawyer can just end the war, right? It's, well, what has happened, right? And I thought of another phrase that I often see in the media, and that is Trump's diplomatic style, right? How Trump is changing diplomacy or things like that, right? He's transforming diplomacy and all that. And so to that I say, all right, if someone needs heart surgery and I brought a surgeon who does not follow the proper way of performing heart surgery, but has his own style, where he does not put the patient under anesthesia and other things, right, that are just not commonly accepted as part of the profession or the craft or the tradecraft, the skills, whatever. Would you go under the knife with this surgeon
From the
performing
RFK School of Medicine, I presume.
Right. Well, yeah. So why, if the answer is no, right, and also if the answer is no to the question, would you hire a lawyer who is training on the job, right? Why would you hire someone who has never practiced anything close to diplomacy, has barely any qualifications to actually practice diplomacy, right? Why would you think that diplomacy is so much less important than the law and medicine, when in fact what diplomats do is protect and advance the national interest of the country, right? And if they do their jobs well, we don't have to use the military to achieve various foreign policy goals.
Just sort of skipping around on this one, though, much regarded and ballyhooed is Richard Holbrooke, for example. And I met him, and he was indeed a very effective diplomat. But then you come to the question of what is diplomacy for? And when it came to negotiating the end of the war in Bosnia, it was quite clear his task was not to deliver a long-standing peace in Bosnia, but to deliver an immediate crowable victory for the Clinton administration so that they could declare peace and get the Republicans off their back. And that we're seeing the consequences of that in the Balkans now, where the sort of Rube Goldberg system he patched together is falling apart. But that's one of the problems with diplomats, is obeying orders in some circumstances is not always a good alibi when the consequences are disastrous like this.
Well, you're talking about the relationship between diplomacy and politics.
Yes.
Which you cannot escape. I wrote a piece in the New York Times a few years ago that began something like the politics and diplomacy go together, whether you like it or not, or politics influences diplomacy. But here's the thing: great diplomats know how to influence politics, right? And they also know where the national interests and the political interests of their superiors intersect and where they diverge, right? And they make the best of it. Now, Holbrooke was out of the Foreign Service by the time he negotiated the Dayton Accords, of course. He was a political appointee. He had been in the Foreign Service for a few years in the 60s and then had left. And so he was at the time holding a politically appointed position. So it wasn't surprising that he, in fact, took politics into account. But he also was very shrewd. Even if he had been still in the Foreign Service, he still would have taken politics into consideration. Unfortunately, you cannot have diplomacy without politics because, first of all, at least in a democracy, the president or the prime minister is the elected person, and that's what democracy is about, right? And so whether you're a political appointee or a career appointee, you are still appointed by some politician, right? And you should keep that in mind. You must carry out the policy of the administration in office. This is the second most difficult thing in diplomacy, in professional diplomacy, which is to implement and promote policies that you disagree with. Speaking of Bosnia, you will remember what happened before Dayton, when 5 people resigned from the Foreign Service when Warren Christopher was
secretary. Yes, I knew them at the time, of course.
Right, exactly. And they resigned. So 5 resigned because of Bosnia, and then 3 resigned over Iraq in 2003. Not many, right? Out of thousands, not many. But these people decided that it'd gone too far, and they could not justify serving that administration or and working to carry out those policies. But see, people. This is why I was talking at the beginning about there needs to be a place where people can go to train like diplomats so they know what they're getting themselves into. If you don't know that you will have to promote and advance policies you sometimes disagree with, and sometimes you vehemently disagree with, you should not be going into this profession, right? But unfortunately, many people don't know, and you'd be surprised what this should be very logical. But I've met people in the U.S. Foreign Service who told me that once they came into the Foreign Service, a few months in, they realized they didn't like living abroad. What? What do you think you'll be doing? I'm sorry, right? It's just not many of those people, but I've met them. And some of them leave after the first 2 tours. Some of them adapt and stick around, or maybe they get married in the Foreign Service.
I think it's the price they have to pay to get a Mac mansion in Silver Springs.
Oh, you mean the ambassador's residence if they ever become an ambassador?
Yes. Well, also afterwards, there are post-retirements in the vicinity in Virginia and Maryland.
Look, at least in most democracies, career diplomats never make enough money to have a mansion of that sort you may have in mind. The ambassador's mansion may be the only one. Some of them, very few of them, will get to. But here's the thing: historically, over the past half century, about 30% of ambassadorships have been taken away from the career people and given to political appointees, right? Most of them with no qualifications to practice diplomacy. And now it's even more. Actually, right, I mean, first of all, now it's a huge anomaly because we have most ambassadorships are currently vacant. And the few that are not vacant are overwhelmingly political. So if you think of Greece, Britain, Belgium, for example, Paris, they're all political appointees. And 30 career people were called back in January. And now, because of the Senate confirmation process, meaning that it's not happening, we have posts where mid-level officers are in charge as acting because
this has a double effect because you mentioned before about part of the role of a diplomat is to act as the eyes and ears of the country in the whatever their post is, and one shudders to think of how the already muddied and cloudy thinking of this administration is if they're getting input from these people across the world, if they're getting any input at all.
Well, from what I've seen, I don't think this administration understands any of this, right? I don't think they value any of this. I think they have the impression that all the people in the Foreign Service are liberals or not worth listening to. And I must say, again, based on the experience of the last year or so, it seems to me, at least since I've been around, and I've been covering US diplomacy now for at least for 26 years, this administration has the least diplomatic competence of any other. And I would be saying this if this were a Democratic administration. Well, this has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats or any of that. Just when I look at how they approach foreign, I'm pausing here because another phrase that I think is inaccurate these days, Trump's foreign policy. I'm sorry, there is no foreign policy. Trump has whims. He doesn't have policies, right? Policy is something that is systematic. It's something that you debate. It's something that goes through an interagency process where different parts of the government.
You mean making America great again is not a policy?
No, it's an ideology.
Of course.
Right? So there is no NSC, national NSC process, right? The National Security Council. Yes, there is NSC. Rubio is that's his other hat as the head of the NSC, and apparently he spends most of his time at the White House these days, and that's fine. But there isn't much in terms of staff, right, to prepare options for the president, because their mantra is that the president knows best, right? There is very little advice. Now, when he's in a bind, like with the Strait of Hormuz, right? When he's in such a terrible situation, when he has threatened something historically terrifying as genocide of an entire nation, or what he said, civilization. And when you also want that country with this huge leverage, in fact, give up that leverage, and you have no idea what to do, that when you do need advice on that. So I'm sure that he did listen to some people on that. He also listened to some people before he started the war, but in the end, as far as I understand it, most of the advice was not to start the war, or at least to delay it. But unfortunately, he listened mostly to Bibi Netanyahu and to Hegseth. So anyway, my point is there is really no policy process, and so I can't speak of Trump's foreign policy, and so that's why I paused to think about how to phrase it. In terms of the administration's track record when it comes to, let's call it, foreign affairs, or maybe foreign entanglements or foreign engagements. When I look at just the way that they're done, that they're planned, that they're analyzed, in terms of influence, because let's face it, however many things we may say about diplomacy, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that diplomacy is about influence, right? We have all these embassies and consulates not because we want to wave the flag everywhere and send people to attend conferences. We have it because we want to have influence over the decisions and actions of that country, right? That's the real purpose of diplomacy, whether they admit it publicly or not. And so when I look at that, the actual practice of diplomacy, of diplomatic skill, of diplomatic outcomes, what has this administration to show for it, right? Possibly the Gaza deal, right? Possibly, and there are many people who didn't think it was that great of an outcome, but because, let's see, first of all, we know what's happened since. But anyway, let's give them that, right? They deserve credit. That wasn't really Witkoff as much as Jared Kushner, who has no official role, by the way. And that's another. Next week, I have a piece coming out that says that rarely in human history, corruption in diplomacy has been this brazen. And by the way, in the Middle Ages, corruption was part of diplomacy, and it was accepted. All right, bribes were just, because it was mostly about monarchies and all that. But
the Byzantines was based on them having lots of gold solidi on Byzance that they could spread around.
Right. So that's another topic of corruption in diplomacy and what it does ultimately to the profession and the outcomes. But when I look at how the administration approaches various international problems or situations, right, it follows this pattern. Trump wants something, right? He issues threats, right? He says, this is what I'll do. But if you think you deserve a better deal, come back to us and offer us a better deal, right? That is the pattern. That is the template of whatever, that process is, but it's not diplomacy. And sometimes you do see little seeds or maybe trickles of some sort of a diplomatic process if the US embassy in that other country gets involved, right? But most of the time they do not. As is well known by now, Steve Witkoff does not use career diplomats. He doesn't listen to career diplomats. He just doesn't think they have anything to offer. And there are people at the State Department that in some capacity at least say they work with him. But I think pretty much all of these people are political appointees. Look, I don't want to also sound like there are no people in the Foreign Service who are helping the administration do various things that would be considered unprofessional, unethical, whatever the case may be, or unwise when it comes to advancing the interests of the country. They may be doing it because they agree politically with the administration. They may be doing it because they think they have no other choice when it comes to their own career and professional future, because civil service, government service, is well, yeah, it may be calling for some people, but for naturally it also is a ticket to, let's call it a stable, financially stable retirement, right? And so there are many people at the senior levels who are still around, who haven't been fired or forced out in any other way. They're still around. They have a few years to go before they qualify for a good pension. They have families. Sometimes they have children still in school, in high school or college, right? They cannot afford to lose their jobs because they're not sure whether they can find another
They
one.
can always call and confer with Peter Mandelson, who is in a similar position.
Anyway, so they stick around and they swallow whatever pills
Well,
they
finally,
think they
because
need.
we don't want to we don't want to take up your whole afternoon, but of course we started off on this on journalism and diplomacy. So, what do you think the ambassadorial role is with dealing with the press in a foreign country? Because I've met some consummate people who realize that you don't just talk to the principals, you're talking to the country, and if you talk to the press, you can create impressions, you can conjure up a big stick out of nowhere.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because I used to train I used to train journalists. In fact, sometimes the State Department would ask me to go to some country, and the embassy would organize a seminar or some sort of other training for journalists in that country, particularly in developing countries. And now I train diplomats in, among other things, how to deal with the media. So it's very interesting to do this on both sides of the barricade. But before I truly answer the question, and before I forget, let me mention, in case this might help, we train both current or working diplomats and aspiring diplomats, because as I said, my goal was to become the first place and still the only place in the world where you can train like a diplomat and get a realistic sense and taste of what the career is before you become a diplomat, before you join the government. And so in that respect, our summer Diplomatic Academy is the flagship program. And so we're currently accepting applications for the summer Diplomatic Academy. The website is diplomaticacademy.us. If any of you listening know anyone who might be interested, maybe you have a child or a nephew or
or maybe you've realized that journalism is a bit of a dead end as well at the
moment. But to be honest, I wish there had been a program like this when I was starting out as a journalist, because I could have used it to learn how diplomacy works. Because how do you cover it well if you don't know how actually it works, right? And it takes years, as you know, to learn how it works, even as a journalist. And so it would be nice to have all this before you even start out. But I now tell diplomats, when they work at an embassy, whether they are the ambassador or the head of a section or just a public affairs, public diplomacy officer or the spokesman of the embassy, that they should only talk to the media when they have a very specific reason to do so. Right? And of course, if I were to train journalists, I will tell them, dig up stories.
Talk to them all the time. Get them drunk.
Well, I mean, I would prefer, more professional ways. But the fact is, at least with American embassies, and that is not the case with many other countries' embassies, particularly Russian and Chinese embassies, by the way. But let's face it, if a member of the media in any country were to approach the US embassy with either a question, just for a quote, for a story, or a request for an interview with someone, they will respond. I think in more than 90% of the time, they will respond. Now, they will give you, at least they'll say no comment if they really have nothing to say. They may not let you interview the ambassador, at least not now, right? But maybe there will come a time in a couple of months when the embassy will have an interest of putting the ambassador on TV, right? And maybe then you can do it. But you are right that personal relationships matter a lot. So part of the tradecraft of a foreign service officer, as my last book points out, doesn't matter whether you are consular or political or economic or whatever, right? Or public diplomacy. Once you arrive in your host country, you should make it a point, just as you go around and meet and build relationships with people in the government, you should also make it a point to go and do this with people in the media, because you never know when you might need them. And also it helps you when you do get an inquiry or some sort of request from someone you don't know, then it helps to know someone who does know this person who is approaching you, right, in terms of how much you can trust them, if at all, right? So absolutely, this is
essence of diplomacy. Be nice to journalists. Buy them drinks, entertain them, be approachable.
Yes, although I mean it depends on the personality. There are some journalists that don't appreciate it when someone is just overly nice to them, right? They think they're trying to hide something or just kiss their behind for the wrong reasons or whatever the case may be. So just as long as you get to know the person and understand how they work, right? How they what their outlook might be, what their worldview might be, and of course the next step would be to potentially even form friendships, which is tricky, but it's part of life. And so this we write about this in the book as well, which is to say, be careful as a diplomat who you make friends with, right?
Yes.
And now, I mean, you might think that journalists would be sort of down on the list of people that a diplomat will want to become friends with, but actually there are people who will be further down on the list. And of course, I mean diplomats from enemy countries, right? Because let's face it, even though the public, the ubiquitous public perception that all diplomats are spies is completely inaccurate, there is still the work of intelligence that is kind of meshed into diplomacy, just because intelligence people work at embassies. I mean, it is what it is, right? I wish that weren't the case, because it gives diplomacy a bad name, but it is what it is. And so
some people give journalism a bad name as well.
yeah, and so but again, this all that we've already said contributes to this argument that it's not easy to be a diplomat. I mean, a real good, effective diplomat, right? You have to take into consideration politics, intelligence, right? How you work with your intelligence and military people, colleagues, because you all work for the same government. You should be on the same page, and often that's not the case. Yes, absolutely, the media. There is, especially in this age, right, with the media, and even to this day, and even though we barely have any ambassadors right now, proper ambassadors, right, not acting, with proper ambassadors around the world, the fact is that the media in almost every country cares about what the American ambassador and the American embassy do and say. They do. It's a fact. And the U.S. ambassador in your average country, your sort of mid-sized country, is a very public persona. They write about him or her in the media. They're invited everywhere. They want to be interviewed on TV. I mean, the
platform.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Although these days, I think they are trying to keep a low profile, because I think they would not know how to answer many of the questions.
I was going to say, anything they say is bound to be wrong for someone in Washington.
Yeah, and it's also, look, when diplomats speak publicly, usually, there are exceptions, but usually what they say is based on direct instructions from the headquarters, right? Talking points, right? It can be also based on public statements by the president or the prime minister, the foreign minister, a secretary of state, and also published documents that have to do with certain policies, right? That's where diplomats get the content, the material that then they share with the press. Very few diplomats would dare to express personal opinions because they're not there to speak for themselves, but to speak for the country they represent.
That's why I like Sergei Lavrov. He was full of them in the
Yes. Now,
bar.
yes. I mean, there are some skillful diplomats, and then there is some tricky. Well, no, there's a better word for it, but like Holbrook, right? Who find a way, even while speaking for the country for they represent, and speaking or articulating policy, to still make it about themselves.
Yes.
Right? It's a skill, and Holbrook had it.
Indeed, he did. Well, Nick, I think that's all that we've got time for now. This is Ian Williams from the President of the Foreign Press Association, and I've been talking to Nicholas Kralev from the Washington Diplomatic Academy on the latest edition of Inside Out, our Foreign Press Association podcast. It's been invigorating and stimulating, and I hope to speak to you again soon. And it is fortuitous that we should speak just on the edge of a diplomatic disaster. And just for posterity, since I've only just discovered, here he is, mission accomplished.
Yes, we'll see. This is very tough. This is very tough. And many analysts are already saying that whatever deal Trump, and this obsession with the word deal is just also ridiculous. But anyway, but any deal that Trump gets out of this would in fact be so much worse than the status quo before the war.
Yes.
Right.
And even than the status quo before he ripped up the agreement to begin with. I think that's accepted.
But how is that competent, right? How is this a victory? It's very difficult to understand.
We're talking about somebody who isn't. Anyway, we're straying over. I've already given the finale. So, but look, keep in touch and let me know. It's been great to reacquaint ourselves, and let me know what other moves you have that we can broadcast and discuss.
Well, thank you. Yes, yeah, good to reconnect after all these years, and let's hope that, as I always say, diplomacy is the world's last hope.
God help us. Okay, thanks very much.